The midday sun fell at perfect angles over the city, casting sharp shadows between the glass and steel buildings. Despite the relentless bustle of cars and the hurried pace of pedestrians inside Westfield Mall, everything seemed to follow a slower, almost choreographed rhythm. The shopping center was a reflection of modern luxury, polished marble floors, massive windows letting in natural light, and an endless array of exclusive stores where every item seemed to gleam under the meticulously designed lighting meant to seduce buyers. Click subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always stay updated with our latest videos and never miss a thing. Among the sea of shoppers browsing storefronts and display cases, Sarah Miller walked with the determination of someone who always knew exactly where they were going. She had no intention of staying long. Her plan was simple: buy a new pair of running shoes, and if she was in the mood, maybe treat herself to a protein shake before heading home. She wore comfortable, simple clothes, yet her presence did not go unnoticed. Her athletic-cut grey hoodie and black training pants weren't flashy, but her posture and gait radiated a natural authority that few people possessed. Even off-duty, her military training was ingrained in every one of her movements. Her shoulders squared, her chin slightly raised, her gaze always scanning the surroundings before settling on any one point. It wasn't just a habit, it was instinct. At 42 years old, Major General Sarah Miller had spent more than half her life in the military. Her record spoke for itself: missions in war zones, peace negotiations with insurgent groups, training new generations of soldiers. She had faced danger up close more times than she could count, and each of those experiences had shaped her into the woman she was today: a leader, a strategist, a survivor. But none of that mattered here. Here, in this world of gleaming storefronts and platinum credit cards, she wasn't Major General Miller. She was just a black woman in an expensive store. She felt it the moment she stepped inside the sporting goods store. It wasn't immediate, but little by little, the signs began to appear. A few extra seconds of scrutiny from the cashier before greeting her. The subtle shift in posture from the woman browsing sports jackets nearby, as if calculating the distance between them. The whispered words of two young white women flipping through a rack of T-shirts who, for no apparent reason, opted to move to the other side of the store. Sarah didn't need anything more than that. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't an assumption. It was experience. She had felt it before, in different places, under different circumstances, from her childhood in a modest neighborhood to her rise in the military, where she had always needed to prove herself twice as capable to be recognized, half as often. She knew how to read body language, fleeting glances, involuntary gestures that exposed the prejudices embedded in society's skin. Still, she ignored the discomfort and walked toward the sneaker section. Her time in the military had taught her never to react immediately to a threat that hadn't fully manifested. Assess. Read the situation. Observe and act only when necessary. As she browsed the different models, a young employee approached her with a nervous smile. "Can I help you with something?" he asked. Sarah lifted her gaze calmly and nodded. "I'm looking for running shoes," she said, her voice firm but polite. "Something with good cushioning." The boy nodded quickly and began pointing out some options. Sarah scanned the shelves, neatly arranged by price and brand. Her fingers brushed against a few pairs as she evaluated the lightness of the materials. Even as her mind focused on the purchase, a part of her remained alert, registering the movements around her. What she didn't know was that a few meters away, someone else was watching her. Troy Beckett ran a hand over the back of his neck, feeling the slight dampness of accumulated sweat. It wasn't an especially hot day, but something inside him stirred with unease. Leaning against a dark marble column, he pretended to scroll through his phone, though his attention remained fixed on the woman inside the sporting goods store. From the moment he saw her, a small spark of suspicion ignited in his mind. Not because he knew her, Not because she had done anything in particular, but simply because she didn't fit. Her clothes were too simple, her posture too straight, her movements too calculated. Something about the way she moved through the store unsettled him, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. For him, instinct had always been enough. He had served in the police department for over 20 years, patrolling the streets, confronting criminals, responding to emergency calls. Over time, he had developed a kind of sixth sense. He could detect trouble before it happened, anticipate suspicious situations before they turned dangerous. At least, that's what he liked to tell himself. What he never admitted, what he didn't even allow himself to think, was that his so-called instinct was tainted. Over the course of his career, Beckett had accumulated multiple complaints for arbitrary detentions, aggressive interrogations, and racial profiling. But, as always, those complaints had disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of the department. His colleagues backed him up, his superiors protected him. After all, he was a good cop. Wasn't that what they always said? Today, however, he wasn't on duty. He wore worn-out jeans and a plain white cotton t-shirt, but his gun and badge were still visible on his belt. He had spent the morning at the mall, simply killing time, with no particular plan, until he saw the woman. There was nothing concrete to justify his growing suspicion, but that was the thing about Beckett. He never needed a real reason. Help our channel grow. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our upcoming content. And let us know, where are you watching from? Comment below. Inside the store, Sarah Miller continued her shopping, seemingly oblivious to the eyes drilling into her from outside. She selected a pair of sneakers from the shelf and examined them, with the meticulous attention of someone who never made rushed decisions. She flexed the sole, pressed the foam with her fingers, and evaluated the shoe's weight in her hand. The young clerk assisting her kept a forced smile. He didn't say it out loud, but his body language screamed discomfort. "These have excellent cushioning," the young clerk said, pointing to a high-end model. "They're perfect for long-distance running and—" Sarah lifted her gaze, calm but firm. "I'll take these," she interrupted, pointing to the shoes in her hand. The clerk nodded quickly and led her to the checkout counter. Outside the store, Beckett watched her every move. When he saw her pull out a credit card and hand it to the cashier, his jaw tightened. Stolen card, he thought instantly. Of course, he had no proof. But in his mind, an entire story had already formed in just a few seconds. A black woman in athletic clothes, shopping at an upscale store, acting too confident. She had probably stolen the card. She was probably trying to buy something before getting caught. It wasn't the first time he'd had that thought, and it wouldn't be the last. Inside the store, Sarah felt the weight of his stare even before she turned around. It was an acute instinct she had developed in the military. A heightened awareness of threats, a sensation at the nape of her neck, a tension in the air. Even in a safe place, her body reacted instinctively, like she was back at a foreign base, surrounded by enemies on hostile ground. When she turned her head and saw the man leaning against the column, his hand near his belt, she knew she was being watched. The cashier handed back her card with a polite, "Thank you," but Sarah barely heard him. She took her shopping bag and walked toward the exit with the same controlled composure she had mastered over years of service. There was no reason to worry. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she knew exactly what was coming next. The soft echo of her footsteps against the mall's polished marble floor was steady. Sarah Miller moved with her usual confidence, her shopping bag in one hand, her eyes fixed ahead. But every fiber of her body was on alert. She didn't need to turn around to know that the man by the column was following her. Years of training had taught her to detect subtle shifts in the environment, to identify behavioral patterns that others ignored. And this man, white, hardened features, a visible gun on his belt, moved like a predator on the hunt. The mall continued its usual buzz, oblivious to what was happening. Families strolled from store to store. Teenagers laughed together. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. But for Sarah, the outside world was fading, leaving only a suffocating pressure in her chest. She took a few more steps, making sure she wasn't imagining it. No, she wasn't. She could feel him behind her, matching her pace. Her instincts told her this man wasn't going to let her out of his sight until something happened. Whatever story he had constructed in his head, it wasn't finished yet. She took a deep breath, keeping her stride firm. She wasn't going to let this shake her. She had faced worse. She had been in war zones, survived ambushes, negotiated with armed men in desperate conditions. One man's prejudice wasn't going to intimidate her, but that didn't mean she wasn't in danger. "Excuse me, Mum." The voice behind her was rough and firm. Sarah stopped, turning slowly on her heels. She showed no surprise. No annoyance. Just calm, a dangerous calm. The man in front of her was exactly as she had imagined. Grey eyes, a face hardened by years of unquestioned authority, an aggressive stance disguised as professionalism. His hand rested on his gun holster, an action that needed no explanation. "Can I help you with something?" Sarah asked, her voice completely composed. The man tilted his head slightly, as if trying to read her better. "I noticed you acting suspiciously in the store," he said, in a tone that pretended to be casual but carried an implicit threat. "Can I see your ID?" Sarah felt her heartbeat intensify in her chest, but outwardly she showed nothing. "Excuse me? I asked for your identification," Beckett repeated, his tone sharper this time. "Just a routine measure." Routine. Sarah nearly laughed. There was nothing routine about an off-duty armed man approaching her in a mall and demanding her ID. This wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't curiosity. This was a veiled attack. "Have I done something wrong, officer?" she asked, measuring every word. "You're acting very nervous." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Nervous? I wouldn't say that." Beckett's expression hardened. "Showing resistance, I see." Sarah took a step closer, not enough to trigger a defensive reaction, but just enough to make something very clear. She wasn't a victim. "Listen, I don't like repeating myself," she said, her tone smooth. "If you believe I've committed a crime, I invite you to call an on-duty officer and press charges. If not, I suggest you stop harassing me." Beckett's face tightened. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. Maybe discomfort, maybe fear. Not this. Not absolute, unwavering defiance. His hand on his belt shifted slightly, fingers tightening around the grip of his gun. Sarah saw it. The exact moment he made his decision. The precise second when this stopped being a simple confrontation and turned into something far more dangerous. Beckett drew his weapon. He pulled it out in a swift, practiced motion, aiming it directly at Sarah. The mall froze. The noise vanished in an instant. The air became dense, heavy. Some people backed away, others gasped in horror. Store employees peeked from behind counters, too afraid to intervene. Sarah didn't move. She could feel the cold weight of the officer's gaze on her skin, see the slight tremor in his hands, the uneven breathing he was trying to control. This wasn't the first time she'd had a gun pointed at her, but this was different. Because she wasn't on a battlefield, she wasn't in a military operation. She was in her own country, buying shoes on her day off, and yet there was a loaded gun in her face. She took a deep breath. Her military instincts wanted to act, to take him down in one swift motion. But she couldn't. Not here, not with the narrative already stacked against her, because she knew exactly how these stories ended when the person on the other end of the gun was black. Beckett, however, was too trapped in his own mentality. To him, this was a confrontation. A moment of authority. He didn't realize he was seconds away from destroying his career. Sarah slowly raised her hands to chest level, moving with the careful precision of someone who refused to give any excuse. "Drop the bag," Beckett ordered, his voice deep and firm. Sarah let the bag slip from her hand, a harmless sound in the middle of a deadly silence. Now, get on the ground. Sarah met his eyes, holding his gaze, and then she spoke. "Officer," she said, her voice commanding, "I am Major General Sarah Miller of the United States Army." Beckett's face tensed. For the first time in the entire encounter, he hesitated, and in that brief moment of hesitation, everything shifted. His doubt lasted only a fraction of a second, but for Sarah, it was enough to detect the crack in his confidence. Around them, the tension was suffocating. No one in the mall moved. Some shoppers had slowly retreated into stores, while others stood frozen, as if afraid that any action might trigger something worse. But the most noticeable thing was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. Minutes ago, the mall had been filled with laughter, murmurs, and hurried footsteps. Now, it was silent. A void of anticipation hung in the air, where the only things audible were Beckett's uneven breathing and the steady drum of Sarah's heartbeat in her ears. Beckett's fingers clenched the grip of his gun harder than necessary. His jaw was tight, his pupils dilated. His body betrayed him. He knew he had made a mistake, but his pride and fear wouldn't let him back down. "Don't make me lose my patience," Beckett growled, his voice losing some of its steadiness. Sarah, hands still raised, showed no sign of submission. She wasn't going to kneel. She wasn't going to give him that power. "Officer Beckett," she said, her voice unwavering, "I strongly suggest you lower your weapon right now." The sound of a phone recording sliced through the tension, and once again the situation shifted. A young man, probably in his 20s, had stepped forward from the crowd. He held his phone high, camera aimed straight at the scene. "She just said she's a general, dude," he said in disbelief. "You're pointing a gun at a goddamn general." Beckett turned his head for just an instant. His eyes burned with anger. "Step away!" But the young man didn't move. In fact, no one did. One by one, more phones were raised into the air, recording from different angles. Sarah didn't need to look around to know what that meant. This moment was no longer just between her and Beckett. It now belonged to everyone who was witnessing it. Beckett's face, which had once radiated authority, began to lose color. He was trapped. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "I don't think you want to do this, officer," she said, her voice razor-sharp with calm. "And I'm going to give you one last chance to correct your mistake before your career ends right here." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Beckett swallowed hard. Sweat was now visible on his forehead. His hand remained firm on his gun, but his finger didn't move. Something inside his brain clicked. He understood. He wasn't going to get away with it this time. Not with so many cameras filming. Not with so many people watching. Not with her, a Major General of the United States Army, standing her ground. A sound of hurried footsteps shattered the tension. Mall security. 2 security guards rushed onto the scene, their faces pale as they took in what was happening. One of them, a tall man in a black jacket holding a radio, raised his hands. "Sir, lower your weapon." Beckett didn't respond. He was trapped in a storm of emotions, caught between anger, pride, and fear, but he had already lost. Another figure stepped forward, moving decisively through the crowd. A woman in a police uniform, Captain Denise Harper. Sarah recognized her name on the badge before she even spoke. "Officer Beckett, holster your weapon immediately." Harper's voice was like thunder. Beckett clenched his jaw, his hand trembling slightly. He started to justify. "I don't want to hear a single excuse." Harper cut him off, her expression unyielding. "Holster your weapon." And then, after what felt like an eternity, Beckett slowly lowered his gun and returned it to his belt. The sound of multiple people exhaling at the same time filled the space. The mall security officer immediately turned to Sarah. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes remained locked on Beckett, reading every micro-expression on his face. He knew. He knew that at this moment, with every phone recording, with every witness watching, his fate was already sealed. Sarah took a breath and turned to Harper. "I want to speak with your supervisor, now." Harper nodded without hesitation. "Come with me." But before leaving, Sarah looked at Beckett one last time. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Beckett's face had turned red with humiliation. But more than that, there was a shadow of panic in his eyes. Sarah held his gaze for a moment longer, and then, without another word, she walked away. The murmurs of the crowd followed her as she left, and behind her, Beckett felt something cold crawl down his spine. He knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Sarah walked beside Captain Harper, leaving behind the scene that had, in just minutes, turned into a spectacle. She didn't need to look back to know the crowd was still there, that the cameras were still recording, and that the ripple effects of what had just happened would spread far beyond the walls of the mall. The walk to the security office was silent. Harper kept a firm pace beside her, her expression hard and focused. She knew she had a major problem on her hands, a problem that couldn't be ignored, that wouldn't disappear with a simple apology, or the usual cover-up tactics law enforcement used in situations like these. Sarah stepped into the small security office and crossed her arms as Harper shut the door behind them. "General Miller," Harper began, her tone much more formal than before, "I want to know exactly what's going to happen to that man." Harper inhaled deeply. "For now, he will be removed from duty immediately. I will personally ensure this incident is reported to the higher-ups." "And do you think that's enough?" Harper hesitated for a moment. Her eyes met Sarah's, and for an instant, they weren't just a police captain and a major general in the army. They were two black women, two professionals who knew exactly how the world worked for them. Harper exhaled. "I know it's not enough, but rest assured, this won't just go away." Sarah nodded slightly. She didn't trust the system. She didn't believe that a simple disciplinary report would change anything. But she trusted evidence, and there was plenty of it. The video, that was the key. Social media was probably already flooded with posts, comments, and debates, because that's what made the difference in cases like these. It wasn't enough to tell the truth. It wasn't enough to be innocent. The only way the system responded was when it was exposed for everyone to see. Want to hear more inspiring stories like this? Then leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. And let's talk in the comments. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know. Sarah ran a hand over her face, feeling the tension locked in her muscles. The adrenaline was still coursing through her system, the weight of the gun pointed at her still lingering, the silent threat in Beckett's eyes still burning in her memory. But she couldn't afford to waver now. "Will there be an official investigation?" Harper nodded, "Without a doubt. And with the number of witnesses and videos, this will blow up faster than he can imagine." Sarah let out a short breath, devoid of humor. "I hope so. Because if Beckett's story followed the pattern of so many others, the excuses would start soon. The media would talk about his impeccable service, his record of bravery. Some outlet would dig up a photo of him in his community, maybe smiling, with his family, perhaps holding a dog. Two narratives would emerge, the good officer who acted under pressure and Sarah's, whose authority would still be questioned, because it always was. Harper seemed to read her thoughts. "What happened today won't be easy to cover up. There's too much evidence." Sarah held her gaze. "We'll see." At that moment, the door to the security office swung open, and a man in a dark suit stepped in, his expression grim, the look of someone already dealing with the fallout of a disaster. "General Miller," he greeted with a curt nod. "I'm Police Chief Edward Langston." Sarah didn't bother to return the gesture. Langston scanned the room, his dark eyes carrying a barely concealed nervousness. He wasn't here to defend Beckett. That much was obvious. He was here because the damage had already been done. "I understand that what happened was unacceptable," he began carefully. choosing his words. "I want to assure you that this matter will be handled with the utmost seriousness." Sarah remained firm. "Then I expect him to be suspended immediately." Langston clenched his jaw. "He will be." But they both knew suspension was only the first step. The real issue was what came next, because police departments had a specific way of handling cases like this. The officer would be suspended while public pressure was high. Then, once the outrage died down, once the videos stopped circulating, everything would return to normal. Beckett knew it. Langston knew it. Harper knew it. And Sarah knew it better than anyone, but this time she wasn't going to let it fade. "I'm going to speak to the press," she said suddenly. Langston blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me? I'm speaking to the press today. As soon as I walk out of here." The police chief's jaw tightened. "General, I understand your frustration, but I would ask that I let you control the narrative?" Sarah interrupted, her tone unwavering. "No, not this time." Harper looked away, but there was a spark of approval in her eyes. Langston made one last attempt. "If we could just discuss this calmly." Sarah crossed her arms. "Calmly? I had a gun pointed in my face, and I still stayed calm. I don't know what more you expect from me." Langston closed his eyes for a brief moment and let out a sigh. He knew he wasn't going to win this fight. "Do what you have to do," he finally conceded, "but be aware that this case is already under official review." "Which means I'll be watching every step you take," Sarah replied without hesitation. "And if this is handled like just another case you try to bury, I'll make sure the entire country knows." Langston gave a resigned nod. "Have a good day, General." Sarah turned to Harper. "Thank you for your intervention." Harper tilted her head slightly. "I just did what needed to be done." Sarah held her gaze for a second longer. She knew Harper had probably faced similar situations within her own force. That if she hadn't been in a position of command, she too might have been a victim of the same kind of profiling. But she didn't say it out loud. Without another word, Sarah turned and walked out of the security office with the same composure she had when she entered. Her mission wasn't over yet. Now she had to make sure the whole world knew what had happened. The cold air hit Sarah's face as she stepped out of the mall. The sky had changed. Grey clouds gathered on the horizon, a reflection of the storm brewing beyond the walls of the building. Around her, the crowd hadn't entirely dispersed. People still stood with phones in their hands, some recording, others whispering among themselves, while some simply watched in silence. But as soon as she took her first steps outside, a wave of flashes momentarily blinded her. The press was already there. Cameras pointed in her direction. Journalists pushed against each other, trying to get close enough to ask questions. Microphones with various network logos extended toward her, seeking her statement. The story was already out of control. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Sarah stopped in her tracks, her expression unshaken. She took a deep breath. She had been in far more chaotic situations before. "General Miller!" a reporter shouted, shoving through the crowd. "Can you confirm what happened inside the mall?" Another voice rose over the commotion. "Officer Beckett has been suspended. What is your response? Do you plan to take legal action?" The questions came in a relentless barrage. Sarah assessed the scene. She knew this was her opportunity. The narrative was in her hands now. With a composed gesture, she raised a hand, signaling for silence. And surprisingly, she got it. The murmurs faded. The cameras kept rolling. Everyone was waiting for what she had to say. This was the moment. "My name is Major General Sarah Miller," she began, her voice firm, clear, unwavering. "I have served in the United States Army for over 2 decades. I have been in war zones. I have led critical missions. I have risked my life in service to this country." She paused briefly. "And yet today, in my own country, on my own day off, a man decided that I did not belong here." A murmur spread through the crowd again, but Sarah continued. An off-duty police officer pointed a loaded weapon at me without justification. Why? I don't know, but this is an old story, a far too familiar one. She took a step forward, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. Today, it was me. But we all know this has happened to others, to those who don't wear a uniform, who don't hold a rank, who don't have a platform to speak. The camera flashes intensified, and that is the real tragedy, Sarah continued, that no matter how much we achieve, how many medals we wear on our chests, how many sacrifices we make, there will always be those who see us only one way. Her words hung heavy in the air. A journalist spoke up. What do you expect to happen now? Sarah didn't hesitate. Justice. She turned fully toward the cameras. That Officer Beckett is held accountable like any other citizen who has committed negligence and abuse of power. That the police take responsibility. That this isn't just another case that disappears in the noise of the media cycle. Another question came from deep in the crowd. And if the police department doesn't act? Sarah gave a cold, knowing smile. Then the entire country will know they didn't. Her words sent a ripple through the press. The murmurs grew louder, but Sarah didn't say anything else because she didn't need to. She took a step back and began walking away from the swarm of reporters. Harper, who had stood a few feet away observing the scene, gave her a slight nod. Sarah had done it. The message had been delivered, and whatever came next, the whole country would be watching. Hours later, the story had exploded across the internet. The video of the mall incident had been shared millions of times within hours. On Twitter, General Miller, Officer Beckett, and police racism were the top trending topics. Social media was on fire with opinions. How is it possible that even a general in the army is treated this way? If this happened to her, what chance do the rest of us have? Beckett has a long history of complaints, and no one did anything until now. This is the problem. News broadcasts interrupted their programming to cover the case. Political debate shows discussed the situation. Analysts and civil rights experts were interviewed about police abuse and racial profiling. Even public figures spoke out. Congress members called for an investigation. Community leaders organized peaceful protests outside the police department. The mayor was forced to make an official statement, and inside the police station, Troy Beckett watched everything collapse around him. Sitting in Chief Langston's office with the television playing beside him, he knew there was no way out. His unpaid suspension was just the beginning. He had made the worst mistake possible. He had underestimated the wrong person, and now the entire country knew it. The following days were a whirlwind. The case didn't fade away. It intensified. Civil rights organizations demanded not only Beckett's dismissal, but also his prosecution. Politicians used the case as an example of the urgent need for police reform. Sarah, for her part, didn't stop. She gave interviews. She spoke at public forums. She became a key voice in the debate on systemic discrimination in law enforcement, not because she wanted fame, not because she wanted revenge, but because she understood what this moment meant. She knew that every black person who had ever been unfairly treated in a store, on the street, in their own home, was watching this. She knew they needed to see that this time the story wouldn't end in silence. Finally, after weeks of mounting pressure, the police department announced Beckett's official termination. But that wasn't enough. Sarah made sure this case wasn't just about one officer losing his job. She made sure it became something bigger, because the real victory wasn't just punishing one man. It was ensuring that no one else would ever have to live through what she had that day.